Okay.
So we're gonna start this like it's an AA meeting, and I'm gonna say my name is Grace and I'm an agnostic, and I do see the irony in that. I do understand that. This is Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Aberdeen, South Dakota. The interior has got like that 70s wood paneling, you know, the acoustic guitars, praise band, that's the sort of vibe. I was baptized here as a baby, and I went through the confirmation program as a teenager, and one could say that to this day I am still a official member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. It was nice, you know, it was comfortable here, but for a lot of reasons, when I went to college, I stopped going to church. And maybe that's just what college students do, like it's statistically likely, but there is something unique going on in our time. According to the Public Religion Research Institute, in 2024, 47% of people who left their religion cited negative teaching about the treatment of LGBTQ people as a reason. And LGBTQ respondents were more likely than non-LGBTQ people to say that they left their religion because it was bad for their mental health. It is not hard to imagine why this is the case. It's probably all too easy. American Christian denominations have been overwhelmingly in opposition to gay marriage and non-discrimination laws. Then you've got the Gay Conversion Therapy Network. Oh, there's someone coming. Let's just hold on. Let's let them pass. It's all good. You know, Billy Graham calling the AIDS epidemic God's judgment, etc., etc. But in this video, I want to play devil's advocate, or maybe it's God's advocate, and ask the question: can queer Christianity work? Can we really be gay for God? Anyway, my hands are frozen. Okay. We're inside now, we're warming up. I want to share a few statistics that shocked me. There are over 4 million LGBTQ Christians in the United States. All right. Christians in general, at 54%, say that they think homosexuality should be acceptable in society. It's a real silent majority. So over half of Christians think that homosexuality is fine. I do think a distinction needs to be made between the queer-affirming Christians who have gone through and kind of reinterpreted scripture and their doctrine to make their beliefs more consistent versus the people who are more or less projecting their contemporary political beliefs onto their religion, which I would guess makes up a lot of people who are queer-affirming Christians. So for instance, I have a friend who is a pretty devout Catholic, but is very pro-LGBTQ. And I once asked her what she makes of the possible tension between her political beliefs and the church's doctrine. And to be clear, the official church doctrine of the Catholic Church is that homosexual people need to be chaste, right? That homosexual acts are immoral and unnatural, which we will get into later. But put simply, the Catholic Church remains the largest Christian denomination in the world, and in the present day, they're pretty damn clear about their condemnation of LGBTQ expression. I don't know if anyone remembers last year, there was the news that Pope Francis was calling gay priests the F slur behind closed doors. I don't know. I think that's pretty hilarious, but it's also problematic. I mean, it's kind of funny, not gonna lie. But what my friend told me is that she hadn't really taken the time to sit down and wade through these differences. It wasn't something that bothered her that much. At first I was sort of surprised, confused by this, but I realized she's not LGBTQ. As a woman, she's had to contemplate a lot on sexism and her relationship with the traditional conservative values of the church on that front, right? But the nice thing about being a straight woman in the church is that even though you're placed in a position of inferiority, there is still a place for you. Gay people do not have a role in a church that emphasizes procreative heterosexual marriage like the Catholic Church does. But straight women can fit the mold, right? Although a lot of straight women are becoming disillusioned too. I would wager that a lot of progressive Christians feel the same as my friend. They have this vague sense that the church is just kind of wrong, and there's probably some way to reconcile it. But if you start to question your religion's beliefs, there is a chance that you won't be able to resolve the differences. And you'd be left with a binary choice of your religion and your politics. I think when left down to that binary choice, you would have to pick your religion because it's a first principle. That's what gives you your metaphysics. So when you're evaluating your belief system, you want to start with the foundations, the metaphysics, right? Your first principles, which lay the groundwork for your political beliefs that should necessarily follow or plausibly follow from that groundwork. So if you're a materialist, for example, who doesn't believe in objective morality, that might influence your politics to allow for greater human freedom, because morality isn't real, so people might as well do whatever they want. You wouldn't usually start with the morality of wanting greater human freedom and work back to materialism as your metaphysics, right? It would not work the other way around. I think the same is true of religion and politics. Your metaphysical and moral beliefs that come from religion should probably be the things that inform your political views and not the other way around. But a lot of people want to have their cake and eat it too. And so they leave the issue on the back burner, not to mix metaphors. A lot of these people are well-intentioned, right? But I find it difficult to interact with them when they haven't examined their beliefs and use such amorphous language. Like, I don't know, I just think that Jesus wanted us to love everybody, and like that was the whole point of the Bible, was love, right? And like love is love. I remember that from 2015. Love is probably the core message of Christianity, but I think we're missing some context. It reminds me of this bit from Julia Sweeney's comedy show, Letting Go of God.
All of a sudden, Sister Mary Howard turned to this Miss Roberts and said, "Do you even believe in God?" Well, I'd never heard anyone ask another person a question like that before. Ms. Roberts stared right into the eyes of Sister Mary Howard, and Sister Mary Howard stared right into the eyes of Ms. Roberts, who after an eternity said, "I believe in a force of love in the universe."
That's very helpful. Did you know that you're in a religion with long-standing doctrine and historical context? Oh God, what has Protestantism done to us? I guess everyone's a theologian now. This is avoiding the issue, right? I do want to challenge these Christians to work against their psychology and examine their beliefs, but I also don't want to condescend on this point. Every one of us holds contradictions in our heads. There are paradoxes that we balance in our minds day after day just to get through the day that we may never dissect, or at least it's going to take us a long time to do so. Still, now that we're going into a new era of increasingly repressive politics, I want to be a little more insistent that this is worth a go. Christians who are LGBTQ allies probably need to take a look at this stuff to take themselves seriously and to be taken seriously by others. Or better yet, keep watching this video. Like and subscribe, or else you're homophobic. Honestly, I think a big reason that I lost my religion was that I was getting bored talking with Christians about the same 3 defensive talking points that they had come up with, so as to not thoroughly think about these issues. Let's get serious. Let's get serious about getting seriously gay for God. Part 1. Getting seriously gay for God. So I did read a book or two for this video. Dr. John Boswell was a Yale historian who published a quite unconventional and controversial book in 1981 entitled Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. It won the American Book Award for History that year and was met with a lot of skepticism from traditional theologians. Journalist Brian Bromberger wrote of Boswell, "In gay religious studies, there's before John Boswell and there's after John Boswell." So that's the kind of figure we're dealing with here. And it's hard to put this subtly, but Boswell was like very gay.
And you can see that this is a conflation with Catholic morals. Having blue eyes, being celibate, being unusually intelligent are all abnormal, but they're not the kind of things you would tend to describe as abnormal. You reserve the word abnormal to describe something that isn't what it should be, not what isn't most common. And if you diverge from what ought to be, you do not belong in the state. in the eyes of men. It is dangerous for the state to tolerate abnormality.
He was also incredibly Catholic. Boswell was raised Episcopalian but converted to Catholicism at the age of 15. He was very devoted to the Catholic faith and pursued history degrees at William and Mary and Harvard, examining early church history. When he published Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, he'd been working on the arguments in the book for a good decade. I will be incorporating more recent arguments as well, just so we have a complete picture of the queer theologian viewpoint. But honestly, Boswell covers a lot of ground on his own. Like, this is a genuinely impressive book. But before we get into the arguments, I want to explain the different sides of this debate. So over the years, the homosexuality debate within Christianity has developed into a debate of multiple perspectives. All these claim to be the truest stance on homosexuality and the Bible. In general, there are 4 sides to the homosexual issue in Christianity. Side A claims that queerness was intentionally created by God, and that queer people and queer sex is blessed by God. So that is the view we're going to be talking about today, and it is a view that is complex within itself. Side B claims to honor queer identity, but preaches celibacy. So sex is intended for a man and a woman in marriage, and anything outside of that requires celibacy. Queer people are just part of the population who must remain celibate, like any single person would have to remain celibate. So like, side B people think you can identify as a queer person and that queerness is natural and conversion therapy is bad, but for whatever reason it's a moral necessity to abstain from same-sex relations. So the attraction itself is fine and natural, but to act upon it is a sin. I love asceticism. Deprive me of sexual pleasure, Sky Daddy. Okay, we're not gonna do the edgy atheist shit. Okay, next, side Y claims that homosexuality is incompatible with Christianity and queer need to be celibate or enter a opposite sex relationship, but their views on changeability vary. That's different for side X, which emphasizes the changeability of homosexuality, claiming that heterosexuality is God's original intention for all people, and that gay people can and should address the root cause of their homosexual urges and become heterosexual. Okay, so these are the gay conversion folks, if you're following along. We're going to be talking about side A because that is kind of the underdog here, a full affirmation of queer identity, and it's what Dr. Boswell is primarily concerned with, and that's like probably what you degenerates care about anyway. We'll talk about 4 topics that are important to side A queer theology. Defenses against the 6 Clobber Verses. That is the verses that Christians cite as evidence that Christianity is intolerant of homosexuality. Early Christianity's tolerance of homosexuality. The appeal to nature and the question of homosexuality's naturalness. And lastly, is this all just a projection of present-day liberal politics? I'm going to say from the outset that I'm hyper aware of the fact that it would benefit me psychologically to believe in and adopt these arguments as a queer person. And so I'm keeping that bias in mind. I am skeptical of a lot of this, and I will be inserting my concerns and criticisms of queer theology as we go along. Part 2. The Clobber Verses. Here they are, all the menaces lined up in a row. Let's just take it from the top. So Genesis 19 contains the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah are 2 cities filled with terrible people, and the sinners get destroyed by God in the end. But why are the Sodomites so sinful? Like, what are the Sodomites doing that could be so horrible? Genesis 19 verses 4 through 7 and 24. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing." And then Lot proceeds to offer his own virgin daughters to be raped instead, like a true gentleman. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So typically this passage is used to say that homosexuality is what makes the Sodomites sinful. But queer theologians argue that this is not the essential sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. The problem with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah is that they lack hospitality and are rapists. Attempted rapists. Allegedly attempted rapists. You do not want to get sued by the Sodomites, okay? In ancient times, there were serious social expectations about hospitality called xenia. So xenia, meaning guest friendship in ancient Greek, was associated with rituals of hospitality that were almost as sacred as like religious rituals. Hospitality was based on reciprocity. Hosts respect guests, guests respect hosts. Hosts provide guests with food, a bath, assistance, etc. And guests are meant to not be a burden or threat to the host, and to like share news of the outside world, and to host the host if the host were to become a guest. I don't know all the specifics, but the philosopher Plato talked about the types of guests one may encounter and how to best host them in his work Laws. And later, the Roman architect Vitruvius commented on how Greeks would build and decorate their homes under the expectation that they would be hosting strangers in their guest apartments. With that context in mind, it seems likely that gross inhospitality is the primary concern in Genesis 19, not the homosexual acts specifically. But I do think the fact that the sinful men of Sodom and Gomorrah were into homosexuality isn't the most flattering. I mean, it's not very flattering that Lot offered his daughters either. Maybe what we're getting at here is that the Old Testament is generally uncomfortable. There's like uncomfortable things happening in the Old Testament. John Boswell argues, quote, "On the basis of the text alone, there would seem to be 4 inferences one can make about the destruction of Sodom. First, the Sodomites were destroyed for the general wickedness which had prompted the Lord to send angels to the city to investigate in the first place. Second, the city was destroyed because the people of Sodom had tried to rape the angels. Third, the city was destroyed because the men of Sodom had tried to engage in homosexual intercourse with the angels, which is, I guess, slightly different from rape. Fourth, the city was destroyed for inhospitable treatment of visitors sent from the Lord. Although it is the most obvious of the 4, the second possibility has been largely ignored by biblical scholars, both ancient and modern, probably due to ambiguities surrounding homosexual rape. Since 1955, modern scholarship has increasingly favored interpretation 4, emphasizing that the sexual overtones to the story are minor, if present, and that the original moral impact of the passage had to do with hospitality." Jesus himself apparently believed that Sodom was destroyed for the sin of inhospitality. "Whoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." So that's that on Genesis 19. Okay, what about Leviticus? Don't we all want to hear about Leviticus? Aren't these are like the really famous ones, right? Leviticus 18:22. "Man shall not lie with man as with woman. It is an abomination." Leviticus 20:13. "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." Okay, but are the lesbians winning or what? Like, it's actually a fundamental misunderstanding of lesbophobia, but we're gonna set that aside for now. So at a glance, it's a pretty definitive condemnation of homosexuality. It is an abomination. Gays should be put to death. Full stop. So John Boswell looks at these verses and he says a few things. First, he examines the Greek translation. So this word abomination is translated from the Greek word tova, which has 2 categories of meaning. So there are abominations that are violations of the law or justice, and there are infringements on ritual purity or monotheistic worship. And in Leviticus, it's referring to infringements on purity and worship. He then argues that this means that homosexuality is viewed as unclean, but like not inherently evil. Okay. It's not looking great if it's unclean. These cleanly practices were adhered to at the time to distinguish the Jewish people from other neighboring populations. Okay, I mean, this argument is a little bit lukewarm for me. His bigger argument is that Christians need not heed Jewish laws in Leviticus. Early Christians saw Leviticus as a kind of metaphor for Christian revelation, not a set of laws that they needed to follow. Boswell writes, "The Old Testament strictures against same-sex behavior would have seemed to most Roman citizens as arbitrary as the prohibition of cutting the beard." The issue of the old Jewish law came to a head in the Council of Jerusalem in the year 49 AD, where Christians debated about what parts of the Levitical law Christian converts should be expected to follow. They wanted more pagan converts, but forcing converts to follow all of the old Jewish laws was not exactly helping them evangelize. So basically, they had to make a decision about to what extent these old laws would be enforced in the post-Jesus age. So they came up with 4 prescriptions from Leviticus that converts would have to follow and left the rest of the laws behind. And these included abstention from the pollution of idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from fornication. So fornication relates to like adultery, like extramarital sex, not necessarily homosexuality. So basically, most of Leviticus doesn't matter anymore. Woo! Woo! I was gonna get a popper and I So sadly, we're not done. We have to deal with Paul now. God damn it, Paul. You can't be sexist and homophobic. The woke mob is gonna come after you. You needed to start a right-wing podcast like 1,000 ages ago. You would have been rolling in the dough by now, Paul. So the next 3 verses are from the books of the Bible written by St. Paul, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy. Let's just quickly read them all together and get that over with. I'm gonna practice when you were in speech and debate, you would do speed reading. We're just gonna ram through these. All right. In Romans 1, 26 through 27, Paul writes, "Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error." So here, lesbians might be taking an L. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10, "Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." 1 Timothy 1, verses 10 through 11. "For the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me." Okay, so according to Boswell, 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy have been mistranslated. One of the words, malakoi, which basically meant soft in ancient Greek, never referred to gay people or homosexual acts when it was used in Greek writing. Boswell argues that the church had traditionally interpreted this word as referring to masturbation. He makes a kind of snide argument that the reason the interpretation changed in the 20th century is because, quote, "Few people any longer regard masturbation as the sort of activity which would preclude entrance to heaven. Thus, the condemnation has simply been transferred to a group still so widely despised that their exclusion does not trouble translators or theologians." It's a win for masturbation. The other word that Boswell says is mistranslated in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy is an ancient Greek word meaning male prostitute, arsenokoitai. Yeah, male prostitution is very different from homosexuality. Those things being equated does seem like a distortion of fact, but other interpreters have disagreed with this assessment. What arsenokoitai literally means is the one who lies, sleeps with men. The one is in a masculine form, so the implication is the man who sleeps with another man. Okay? And so some people take this to mean homosexual, while queer theologians are more likely to take this to mean male prostitution. At the end of the day, I don't know. Okay? And since we're on the subject of male prostitution, now might be a time to talk about what Boswell views as the Christian sexual ethic, like what are Christians supposed to do about sex. Boswell writes, the only sexual issue of importance to Jesus appeared to have been fidelity. He was apparently celibate himself. While St. Paul did not specifically comment on gay feelings or lifestyles, he would have disapproved of any form of sexuality which had as its end purely sexual pleasure, and he might have disapproved of relationships directed chiefly at the expression of erotic passion. He did not, however, suggest any connection between sexuality and procreation, a link created by a later age, and he clearly regarded illicit sexuality as that contained within a permanent and monogamous relationship. He not only permitted but urged Christians to satisfy the sexual needs of their spouses. For Paul, Christian sexuality had little to do with purity of the seed or of procreative justification for sexual pleasure, but was rather a question of good stewardship, which does sound all well and good until we get to Romans. So John Boswell does not have any problem with the translation as he does in the other verses. And this makes things a little bit trickier for the queer theologian. As a reminder, the verse from Romans is talking about men having unnatural relations with other men and shameful acts between men, and then women are doing unnatural things. And a popular argument that contemporary queer theologians make is that this verse has to do with temple prostitution and idolatry, not homosexuality. Here is progressive pastor Brandon Robertson making this exact argument.
Quite clear there's a dissent in Romans 1. There's a list of things that happen, and it's the way he describes it is you begin by exchanging the truth of God for a lie, then you start worshiping created things instead of the creator God. Keep going down, you're worshiping reptiles and birds, and then he says something about men exchanging natural relations and women doing the same. That trajectory is one that very clearly, in the cultural context to me, reads as Greco-Roman idolatry, worshipping reptiles and birds, exchanging the truth of God for a lie. He's talking about what was going on in pagan Rome. And the pagan Roman context was that in temples, like the temple to Aphrodite, they would make sexual sacrifices where men would have sex with not just other men, but women and younger people. Women would have sexual sacrifices to Aphrodite with other women and men and all sorts of things. And so Paul is clearly making a case that, hey, if you follow the path of Roman pagan idolatry, you're going to end up with the wrath of God coming against you. I don't think that applies to modern same-sex relationships because I haven't exchanged the truth of God for a lie. I don't worship created things instead of the creator God. My sexuality comes as an expression, as I've said, of my faith in Christ. It was my faith that initially held me back. And the reason I was able to embrace my queer sexuality was because I saw that the culture and context of the biblical text speaking about homosexuality wasn't referring to the kind of desire that I have and that the gay Christians that I know have.
But Boswell, back in 1981, says that this interpretation is inadequate because, first, why is Paul calling out homosexual temple prostitution and not heterosexual temple prostitution, or temple prostitution in general as the problem? The homosexual element seems too specific. Second, it's clear that the sexual behavior itself is objectionable to Paul, not merely its associations with idolatry or temple prostitution. Homosexual acts are shameful acts. Third, it seems like these acts were not done strictly as a matter of ritual or ceremony at the temple because the men are described as having genuine sexual desire. They burned in lust towards one another. So instead of talking about idolatry or temple prostitution, what Boswell argues is that the point of the passage is, quote, not to stigmatize sexual behavior of any sort, but to condemn the Gentiles for their general fidelity. He even says that references to homosexuality are just an analogy to the Roman theological sin of not accepting monotheism soon enough. Then he goes on to say that Paul is condemning not genuine sexuality, but that he disapproves of heterosexuals committing homosexual acts because, that means that heterosexuals aren't acting in their heterosexual nature and aren't treating their sexuality with good stewardship by doing the homosexual act instead. Okay, so my brain is spinning. So I have a problem with these arguments in general. Paul does not seem to distinguish between gay persons and heterosexuals committing the act. all he really condemns is the homosexual act. Wanna come by my place, get tipsy, and do the homosexual act? I don't know, if men are burning in lust for one another, it seems to me like this is a man who is gay and not, by modern standards, a heterosexual. Like, this one is a tough sell for me. And it's a tough sell for those in opposition to Boswell. Richard John Newhouse, a Christian cleric and writer, wrote in 1991, "The element of truth in the claim of the Boswell revisionists is that Paul, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Calvin, and a host of others who lived before the 19th century indeed did not know about a homosexual community in which people are involved in loving, committed same-sex relationships. Historical what-ifs are of very limited usefulness, but we might ask ourselves, what if Paul did know about homosexuality in the way that it is commonly presented today? What if he knew about a significant number of people, constituting a sizable subculture, who engaged in homogenital sex and found heterosexual relations personally repulsive? If he believed that homosexual acts are contrary to nature and nature's God, the plain meaning of Romans 1, it would seem not to make any difference that there are a large number of people who disagree, who engage in such acts, and whose behavior is supported by a subculture and its sexual ideology." There is a final point that Boswell makes about the fact that Paul condemns drunkenness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Paul condemns drinking wine, right? And so the fact that Paul condemns sexual infidelity between men doesn't mean the same thing as condemning gay monogamy. Paul didn't have a word for gay monogamy. None of them did at the time. We don't know what Paul would have thought about a homosexuality that is monogamous, were it to be described to him. But we do know that he primarily associates homosexual acts with sin. So, who's to say? Romans is a problem for queer theologians. That's my conclusion. More than any of the other Clobber passages, Paul seems to clearly state that the homosexual act itself is what is immoral, and so we can run in circles about contrived historical context, etc., etc. But it's a lot of speculation. Part of what Boswell is doing here as well is appealing to the homosexual and heterosexual natures, which is reading a lot into the text. But we're going to get to the commentary on nature later in the video, so we're going to leave Romans. We're going to put a pin in that, in nature for now. And that is all the Clobber Verses. Okay. Some people try to use the fact that God made Adam and Eve, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, as like another Clobber passage, but like that seems to erase celibate people and like other forms of human relationship, like friendship or whatever. Like other relationships exist outside of men and women. So that seems a bit weak to me. But before we close out talking about the Clobber Verses, let's take a step back here and look at what we've been doing, okay? This is the Bible. It's not a small book. It's not a page turner. Out of the 31,000 or so verses in the Bible, 6 of them, maybe, have to do with homosexuality being sinful. Jesus never talked about homosexuality, and so the idea that it's a ticket straight to hell seems a bit man-made and not supported by the text. Boswell argues that the contemporary obsession with homosexuality as sin is overblown and that, quote, the source of anti-gay feelings among Christians must be sought outside the scripture. The Bible does not have a comprehensive sexual ethic, which is why everyone keeps arguing about like what the proper sexual ethic is. It's why the homosexual question alone has like side B, side A, side C, side Z, sides Y. Okay, maybe we can just all agree that there is a lot of ambiguity if we're basing ourselves on scripture alone, and maybe that means that we have a little bit of breathing room on this particular subject, okay? It's not like the worst sin to ever be sinned, and it's not the grand meta narrative. It's not part of like the grand narrative of Christianity. Like, Jesus didn't even talk about it, okay? Like, get over yourselves. Okay. Part 3, Early Christianity's Tolerance of Homosexuality. So from my vantage point, there is that strain in ancient and medieval history that condemns homosexuality, particularly as an act of infidelity. Like, the ancient Jews seem to have something against it in the Levitical law, and St. Paul seemed to not like it because he associated it with sinful people and infidelity. But the queer theologian's argument is that back in that time, they simply didn't have the language for someone who was purely homosexual. A lot of men were having sex with other men, but also they had a wife, so they could continue their important bloodline and birth sons that would like bring honor to the family in war or whatever. I love it. I want to make a claim here that's maybe not 100% true, but which I think might be helpful to understanding Paul and the condemnation of homosexuality, because I think that Christianity was pretty radical in its emphasis on monogamy and fidelity within marriage, and that this emphasis is part of what led to society potentially placing more moral value on the lives of women and women's perspectives. Maybe it's a little too red pill to say that Christianity is what set us up for modern feminism, but it's a little harder to believe that ancient Greek society was doing women any favors. As my Italian classics friend once said while we were discussing Plato's Symposium, that's what happens when you hate women too much. Plato's Symposium is honestly like so funny. Like, if you're gay, you like have to read Plato's Symposium. It's basically like in Plato's Symposium, they act like being heterosexual is a minority position. And I have no idea why ancient Greek scholars were in such denial about this fact for like so many years. Well, actually, I mean, I do have an idea. I mean, they're like homophobic or whatever in their reading of history. Anyway, you don't want to give the 20th century public ideas. So the ancient Greeks would point to relationships like Achilles and Patroclus as examples of the superiority of gayness. And there's even a debate in the Symposium about whether Achilles is the top or the bottom. Like, for real. Achilles is the best of the Greeks and happens to be in a gay-male relationship, and so it follows gay men are simply the absolute best warriors and statesmen. Also, philosophers do conclude that Achilles was the bottom. Power bottom vibes, though. You can't judge a bottom by his demigod status, okay? Don't demigods deserve the opportunity to be dominated by strong men too? So the ancient Greeks were just having a little fun with patriarchy. It kind of reminds me of how we talk about like the homoeroticism of gym bros, because obviously a lot of these men are pumping iron for each other as much as they are for like straight women. Like, ancient Greeks did patriarchy to the max. Women were basically breeders who weren't allowed to leave the household without a man. And meanwhile, the men get to like idolize these other men and just have like sex with them outside of their marriage. Something for today's incels to consider. Maybe sleeping with other men is the highest form of masculinity? I mean, you already hate women. Why sleep with them? Why sleep with women when you can idealize masculinity? Okay, anyway, I should not be giving the incels ideas. Then Christianity came along. And Christianity tended to condemn the overall sexual depravity of the ancient Greeks and Romans, as we see with Paul. The idea that under Christianity, a man would be tied to a woman for the rest of his life and could only have sexual relations with that woman, it does increase the importance of that relationship. Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Becoming one flesh with a woman probably means that you should care at least a little bit about that woman's well-being, at least enough to have a rapport that's conducive to like a stable sexual relationship. Galatians 3:28 says, "There's neither male nor female, you are all one in Jesus Christ." These are the kinds of verses that are the basis for feminist theology. The idea that the Bible supports gender equality, the church should support gender equality. And I wonder if Boswell is right that Paul sees in ancient Greek homosexuality not committed partnerships, but primarily men who are married to women, but are not dedicated to becoming one flesh with their woman. They're having sex outside of marriage, and they don't need to show that respect or love towards women, right? Christianity comes along, says marriage means one flesh, it's men and women, blah, blah, blah. Suddenly men are tied down by their marriages. And in a way, that's kind of like, compared to ancient Greek patriarchy, that's kind of challenging to the patriarchy and the freedom that they were used to, right? And I just wonder if that's had some effect over the course of history and the role of women in public life. I'm just saying, I don't know, it's just something I'm wondering about, if anyone has any ideas about this. And obviously, like, in today's age, the existence of male homosexuality is not a threat to the value of women. It's just like the Greeks were patriarchy maxing, and there needed to be some radical kind of changes going on. So then what did early Christians think about homosexuality? Were they just as homophobic as Christians are today? Well, Boswell argues that early Christians were actually quite tolerant towards homosexuality. That's where the name of the book comes from, Christianity, Social Tolerance. And initially, when Christianity came on the scene, it coincided with the time of increasing repression in the Roman world. So in 392, gay marriages were outlawed, but Boswell argues that law was basically a political stunt and totally toothless. There wasn't even a legal penalty for the crime of same-sex marriage. Later, the empire outlawed homosexual behavior in 533 for the first time, putting it in the same category as adultery, which was punishable by death. Okay, things got homophobic. Things stayed homophobic, okay? The emperor started ordering castrations. They tortured some folks.
We tortured some folks.
And by the church, I am going to be referring to the Catholic Church throughout all of church history. The Protestants, it took them a while to come around. And the Catholic Church wouldn't take a stance on homosexuality until almost 800 years later, in 1179, when the Lateran III Council determined that sodomy be outlawed and offenders would be excommunicated. Some of the new intolerance was a result of increasing asceticism in the 2nd century. Boswell writes, "It is crucial to remember that even where such authorities explicitly condemned homosexuality, they also categorically reject the majority of human erotic experience." Like, St. Jerome apparently said that a man who loves his wife very much is an adulterer. A lot of church authorities argued that any sexual pleasure was bad. And even sexual contact with your spouse was like purely for the purposes of procreation. Like, you cannot even enjoy it a little bit, honey. Okay? Ooh, the ascetics are on something. That is like more, what would you even call it? Like pre-edging? Like, that's like for real. However, in the period after this extreme asceticism, tolerance came back in vogue. Why is that? It's possibly linked with like urbanism versus ruralism. So like Europe was becoming more and more urban at this time, and that was associated with more social tolerance. So after 1100, cities experienced massive growth, and in urban environments, people have to learn how to live with a diverse range of people. This period not only coincided with an emergence of a gay subculture, but also revival of erotic love in general. And people were more educated in this period, so there was a lot more literature, romantic literature, that was written as a result. A lot of the gay literature in this period surrounded the figure of Ganymede. Ganymede is from Greek myth. It's the boy that like Zeus lusts over and plucks out of the earth to be his cupbearer and like, I guess, sex slave in Olympus. Zeus is always on that shit, isn't he? Zeus is on his kidnapping shit. But suddenly, rather than viewing the Greeks as hedonistic and immoral, there's a Greek revival in the educated populace and an interest in the character of Ganymede in medieval Europe. The church at the time was of two minds. One side was a small but mighty group of ascetics who, as we know, were pretty much like anti-sexual pleasure in general. And the other side, Boswell claims, had a positive view of homosexual relations and celebrated them. Does that sound right? Like, that's very different from toleration. I'm skeptical, but medieval historian John F. Benton agreed with Boswell and wrote that historical evidence does indicate that there were those were the two conflicting approaches that arose at the end of the 11th century. Even within the Catholic Church, like, staff, I grew up Protestant. Even within the Catholic Church, there were accounts of gay bishops and priests who, while practicing celibacy, seemingly had strong romantic feelings for men that they expressed in writing. Of course, there were also clergy. It's clergy. Okay. There were also clergy who did gay sex and had to repent because of that. Breaking celibacy is a no-go. And on the flip side, we have more evidence today about gay nuns, which Strange Eons made a whole video about. So, sorry I'm not talking about a lot of lesbians right now. Like, history doesn't, believe in women, so then you also have that. There's, two problems going on at once. Okay. There was also a reemergence of public debates about homosexuality. There's a fictional text where Ganymede and Helen of Troy argue which is better, heterosexuality or homosexuality. Should we have that debate? I feel like that's the debate we should be having, right? We're just sitting here okay, is homosexuality good or bad? Okay, let's put the heterosexuals under the lens. Let's debate it. Who should we get for that debate? That could be good, right? Between Ganymede and Helen of Troy, heterosexuality does win out, but the argument goes on for a really long time, and the homosexual view is treated as totally legitimate. And like I said, the gay poets were also very busy at this time. One of these pro-homo poems from the age reads, "Venus kindles all fires, but the greatest heat is in sex with males. Whoever's tried it knows it. For his face smiles, his complexion shines, his legs are soft, his lap is sweet, his heart gentle, and his beauty charming. His demeanor is open, suppressing shyness, his spirit is ready for the boyish sin, and his body prepared to undergo anything his seducer should ask. This boy surpasses all treasure. Nothing is more blessed than he." Okay. We're bringing back the ancient Greek ambiguity of, is it homosexuality or pedophilia? And that's what real Greek revivalism is about, okay? But that revival was not meant to last. At the end of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, the church authorities came to the conclusion that homosexuality was not acceptable. And that became church doctrine for the rest of history up until the very moment we're living in, where the Pope can say the F slur, and we all move on with our day. The decision to bring the hammer down on homosexuality occurred as a result of the consolidation of political power and the need for greater conformity and control over the population. One area of intellectual thought that needed to be cleaned up was theology. Because how are you going to enforce church authority if you lack a totally comprehensive and prescriptive theology that answers any and all questions anyone could ever have about church doctrine? Right. This movement was called scholasticism, and its theologians attempted to marry ancient Aristotelian logic and the writings of the early church fathers to create a sort of rock-solid dogma that the Catholic Church would base its doctrine on for the rest of time, right? So the church passed that doctrine about sodomy in 1179. It wasn't really enforced with gusto, but things started to get messy. And the gays were put on the chopping block. In 1307, Phillip the Fair ruled France, and he went after the Knights Templar, saying that they were in league with the devil and performed homosexual acts in their sacred ceremonies. Totally unrelated to this fact was that Philip needed money, and the Knights Templar were rich, and if he arrested all of them, he could theoretically seize their treasury and get all the money. And anyway, it's not theoretical, that's what happened. He arrested them all and took their money. Were the Knights Templar actually guilty, dirty degenerates? The jury's out. But probably not. But a kind of moral panic started. If the Knights Templar, a group of Catholic warriors, were all homosexuals, where else might the gays be infiltrating our polite society? Boswell writes, "Fear doubtless played a large role in the disappearance of nearly all manifestations of gay subculture by the mid-13th century, and this in turn facilitated the success of exaggerated and fanciful claims about the harmful and dangerous nature of gay sexuality." The Scholastic period came to a head with a man you may have heard of, St. Thomas Aquinas, and his magnum opus, Summa Theologiæ. It's a summary of theology, according to Wikipedia. Okay, you can't judge me, okay? Let's just be honest. It's probably our most trusted media institution at this point. If you don't trust Wikipedia, I don't trust you. How about that? In the Summa Theologiæ, St. Thomas Aquinas maintained that homosexual practice was contrary to natural law, arguing that the primary natural end of the sexual act was procreation, and since said procreation is carried out from a process of sexual fertilization between a man and a woman, homosexuality is contrary to the very end of said act. And ever since the very goddamn day that Aquinas wrote those little words in his Summary of Theology, the Catholic Church has, up until the present, considered the homosexual act a sin, and has generally promoted straight, monogamous marriage and procreative sex. Ta-da! So, what about this argument from nature? Part 4, the appeal to nature and the question of homosexuality's naturalness. When I was a senior in speech and debate, I gave this informative speech about logical fallacies. And one of the fallacies I talked about was the appeal to nature. So people will argue that because something is natural, that makes it a good thing, but in fact, nature is filled with good and bad things, right? Like death, disease, pain, those are all very natural things, and we tend to view them as bad. But what I didn't address in my high school speech is that there are different ways to define nature as we know it. So there's nature that is the physical world collectively, including plants and animals, the landscape and other products of the earth. And then there is nature, which is the basic characteristics of something, inclinations or destiny. So I could say his dad was a lucky card player, so it's in his nature. That's not referring to like his place in the animal kingdom, but some ephemeral quality that is inherent in that person. So in the medieval world, theologians would often get tripped up about the nature of homosexuality. Some of them would argue this: animals lack reason, and they commit homosexual acts against one another. But humans are superior to animals. Therefore, humans ought to reject homosexuality in order to rise to a more holy, moral nature. But you know what else they argued? Are you ready? Because it's the exact opposite. Animals are purely heterosexual, and that should tell us that it's not natural for creatures like us to be homosexual. So homosexuality must be some demonic, man-made conceit that will lead us astray. It seems like they didn't have the data we have today about animal homosexuality. Like nowadays we understand that there's plenty of homosexuality in the animal kingdom. And this argument also supposes that humans aren't distinctive from animals in a sense. You can actually turn both of these arguments into pro-gay arguments. Like I could argue that animals are purely heterosexual because of survival instincts. And so human homosexuality is actually proof of humanity's distinction from the animal world. The ancient Greeks thought this, right? They thought that the fact that you could enjoy non-procreative sex with the same gender meant that you had a deep connection with that person, something beyond mere survival instincts, right? Like a spiritual connection. This is obviously men we're talking about, of course, the patriarchy maxing, but you get the idea. So in present day terms, is homosexuality in man's nature or not? I mean, like, descriptively, we're talking about it because homosexual things have happened once or twice throughout, like, human evolutionary history or whatever. In terms of what theologian Aquinas thought, he argued the second anti-gay case, that animals are heterosexual and that means we should be too, which seems to conflict with his idea that we're superior to animals. So why is it when he talks about homosexuality, suddenly humans should look to animals for sexual ethics? Aquinas did have some other arguments to kind of try to make it work, which Boswell responds to. So the first one is a syllogism, which says, all sin is unnatural. Homosexuality is a sin. Thus, homosexuality is unnatural. So we're doing a bit of a circle jerk, argumentatively speaking. To define like all sin as unnatural is like we're all just defining terms as the other. The second thing that Aquinas argues is that there are cases in which, although humans are superior to animals, there are cases in which they should be treated the same. And homosexuality is one such case. Why is this? Things are natural to man and animals alike when they relate to the survival of the species. So homosexuality is against nature. So the first thing that is important here is where does celibacy fall in this picture? Like, are people not allowed to be celibate if they have to procreate, right? Boswell says that this argument is ridiculous because then we would be morally obligated to be having sex, procreative sex, kind of constantly. And so what is the point of marriage in this system? Does Aquinas think that we should dedicate ourselves to the survival of our species in the same way that animals do? Like, I don't know if you know this, but rape culture is pretty popular in the animal kingdom. Marital fidelity is a little bit dicey. Offspring are abandoned. Like, why the fuck are we entertaining the survival of the species? Like, okay. Also important here is that, again, Aquinas is arguing in the 1200s that animals are purely heterosexual, which we know is not true, okay? In the 21st century, we know about cute gay penguins, Thomas. You can't hide Roy and Silo from us. We know that the animals be gay, so this just doesn't make sense anymore. Again, I feel it's important to point out how different Aquinas' sexual ethic is from most people today. He thought that sex was strictly for procreation and could never be done just for pleasure, even between spouses. Aquinas says that masturbation is unnatural, which to me, I don't know, like masturbation seems perfectly natural to me. You could say it's immoral or that it's a sin. I can see how you would argue that, but the fact that he says it's unnatural feels like he really isn't using the word natural in the with its most obvious meaning. And yet this is the definitive like sexual ethic for the Catholic Church today. Boswell's debunking of Aquinas' logic I think is fair and logical, but it's definitely controversial. Boswell is pretty much icing himself out of the Catholic tradition, whether he likes it or not. Most of Boswell's arguments thus far have not been about disagreeing with the text or disagreeing with St. Paul. It's about misinterpretation, right? But when it comes to the argument from nature, Boswell is like destroying Aquinas with facts and logic. And Thomas Aquinas is probably the most famous and revered theologian in the history of Catholicism, so it's like, needless to say, maybe he did destroy Aquinas with facts and logic, but that doesn't mean that the Catholic Church is going to abandon 700 years of teaching. My more like sacrilegious pondering is if Boswell would also argue against St. Paul's logic in Romans 1. See how I came back to Romans 1? Like, the appeal to nature is absurd, and so that would mean that Boswell didn't believe that the Bible is a perfect text, and if St. Paul is wrong to call homosexuality unnatural, that means that the Bible can be wrong. But if you're a Christian, can the Bible be wrong?
Part 5. Is this all just political projection?
So, at this point, we've been talking about a lot of dead people's perspectives on Christianity. St. Paul, St. Aquinas, Dr. Boswell.
Fuck you, Reagan. This is all your fucking fault. Fuck your AIDS-denying ass. Fuck your grift.
Let's talk about how queer and progressive Christianity has developed since 1981. So in my limited experience, this is not all progressive Christians, but the foundations of progressive Christianity seem to be based on a few things. The first is a disbelief in the infallibility of the Bible and a more
liberal interpretation of scripture. The second is a sort of liberation theology, social gospel applied broadly. And the third is a counter to politicization from the right. In my political brain, there is an analog to be made with the US Supreme Court precedent and the Bible. So in constitutional law, there are two big approaches to interpreting Supreme Court precedent, right? There's originalism, which conservatives are all about, which argues that the Constitution has to be interpreted in its original public meaning. So if the public did not think that the 14th Amendment covered gay people at the time that the amendment was adopted, then even today, if it makes sense for the 14th Amendment to cover gay rights, they aren't going to let it happen because originalism. Okay. Whereas judicial pragmatists, or the woke libs, if you will, argue for a living constitution and think that the Constitution has this more dynamic meaning that can slightly change and mean different things in new contexts. So if the 14th Amendment says, well, we should all have equal protection under the law, then that can mean that gay marriage should be allowable. That's how we're doing things for now. Okay. So I would argue there's something a little bit similar going on with traditional Christianity and progressive Christianity, that traditional Christians treat the Bible as this like stuffy Iron Age document that doesn't develop in meaning as the years go on, while progressive Christians see the Bible as a living document that can be applied a bit differently depending on the context of what's going on in the world today. The meaning updates to fit what's going on. To me, this does make more sense than in constitutional law, because some people kind of view the Constitution as a holy document in a way. Like, these judicial pragmatists seem to be seeing, oh, it can just apply across time, blah, blah, blah. It actually seems to be more the case that the Bible would be the document, you know, a religious document would be the universal document that can apply across different times, versus the Constitution, which is a man-made structure. But anyway, but nobody in the political realm is arguing that the US Supreme Court precedent shouldn't be adhered to. They just have different views on what adhering to the Constitution means. Alternatively, some progressive Christians do not believe that all parts of the Bible should be obeyed. In other words, they don't believe in biblical inerrancy or infallibility. So generally, progressive Christians are like, yes, the Bible can be wrong, it can be contradictory, it's made by like humans, they had like some divine inspiration, but it's not like the perfect word of God. So that is helpful if you just want to argue that St. Paul didn't really know what monogamous homosexuality was, and he was influenced by the time, so it's kind of whatever. He was just a homophobe. We don't have to listen to him. But you can kind of use that argument to cherry pick whatever you want to believe or not out of the Bible based on your personal or community morality. So I'm not such a fan of this approach. It gets a little bit too postmodern, where it's like, why are we even bothering with Christianity if the text is so meh? Like, this is what allows more progressive Christians to sincerely argue that the sexual ethic of the Bible is just consent, which I think is one of the most egregious political projections I've ever heard. Like, not to be a hater, like, I get that the sexual ethic of the present day political left is consent. We're just like throwing out the 10 Commandments at this point. Like, what the fuck's adultery? Non-consent? Is adultery non-consent? Like, are you a serious person? Sorry, I'm being mean now. But it makes me question their sincerity here, because clearly this is political projection. Like, why even bother with Christianity if you have to do this much backbending? Just be that fucking new age bitch that Julia Sweeney was talking about and believe in the power of love in the universe or whatever, and leave it at that. Second important development for progressive Christianity was the social gospel and liberation theology. So the social gospel was an early 20th century Protestant movement in the US and Canada that argued that Christian ethics should be applied to social problems with a particular emphasis on poverty and economic inequality. Liberation theology was a similar movement that bloomed in Catholic Latin America in the mid-20th century. And I really wonder what contemporary Latin Americans think about the appropriation of liberation theology in the US and other Western developed nations, because I gotta say, it seems like a lot of people ran with it and applied it differently than the Latin American theologians would have. In Phillip Berryman's book on the subject, he writes that liberation theology is an interpretation of Christian faith out of the suffering, struggle, and hope for the poor. It originated as a pretty Marxist movement. That's what the Vatican criticized it for anyways. But a lot of contemporary Christians have widened the lens quite a bit, claiming that liberation theology is about political liberation for all oppressed groups, not just class liberation. And in developed countries, this means, racial minorities and women and queer people. It seems like any group you want to categorize as politically oppressed, you can do so under the banner of liberation theology. But this also just seems to me a kind of political projection of onto your theology. A lot of queer theologians like liberation theology because they can interpret the core message of Christianity to mean that all Christians should be relatively pro-gay because of gay people's political minority status. I'm not sure about that. I think that liberation theology was most targeted in its original form. There are legitimately so many verses about lifting up the poor and how the rich people are going to hell, and these are things that Jesus actually said. This is something Jesus actually cares about. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Bitch, why don't we talk about that, traditionalists? You seem so concerned with gay people, but your fucking president is going to hell. How about that? Your Lord and Savior Donald Trump is going to fucking hell for being a billionaire. So what about that? Okay, I do want to be charitable and say that Jesus did talk about more than the poor, right? He talked about the downtrodden in general, the lame, the blind, etc. But to apply Jesus' words about the poor to gay people, because the meta-narrative of Christianity is about liberating the oppressed, is a little bit of a slippery slope. I can see it when I close one eye and squint. I'm hearing you out, okay? But liberation theology, even in its original, more Marxist form, was never accepted by the Catholic Church. And if you've heard about the prosperity gospel, you know that many evangelical Christians in the United States can easily manage hating the poor, not to mention other oppressed groups, and use a theology to justify that. So I'm also not sure about liberation theology as it relates to queer Christianity, which brings me to my last point about political projection, which is progressive Christianity as a counter to the right's politicization of the religion. So the Catholic Church has always been a very conservative institution. In fact, to last this long, it would almost necessarily have to be a conservative institution. American evangelicalism became much more progressive in the late 20th century, abandoning its previous social gospel version. And I think a lot of progressive Christians would say that evangelicals lost their way. They started caring more about Republican political causes and promoting the free market instead of the actually radical ideology that Christianity has, buried within. Because it's Jesus would have been a socialist. Jesus would probably have been a feminist, There's no male or female, right? I think it's valid for progressive Christians to reclaim their religion and talk about what Jesus did stand for and the ways that the American right has co-opted the religion in a lot of wrong ways. But you know what Jesus didn't talk about? Drag Race. Part 6. Can anyone really be gay for God? Okay, Grace, get to the point. So we've examined all the evidence. What do I think about queer theology? I think a couple things. So first of all, almost everyone agrees, okay, the traditional Christians, the progressives, we all agree that St. Paul had no fucking clue what monogamous homosexuality is, okay? He didn't know what it was, but the traditionalists believe he would have been against it, and the progressives believe he would have been affirming. So in my opinion, I think both sides are doing a bit of historical revisionism because we don't know what Paul would have thought. That's the whole point. Traditionalists are doing historical revisionism by contending that homosexuality was never acceptable. It was never normalized throughout all of Christian history. All the supposedly gay Christians were just two guys sitting 5 feet apart in a hot tub. A lot of theologians simply haven't challenged their heterosexual biases in the same way that classicists participated in the erasure of Achilles and Patroclus. Like, that is heteronormative revisionist history. You would think that if a sexual ethic was totally obvious and consistent throughout church history, then the Catholic Church would be totally unafraid of the likes of John Boswell. But in fact, the Catholic Church did not welcome John Boswell's research. Instead, they acted like they had something to hide.
A favorite story of John's, as he was working to complete the book on same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe, was related to the difficulty that he had in accessing some of these manuscripts, these Greek language manuscripts, in particular at one monastery on Mount Athos. And because the monks there knew about John's work in the history of homosexuality, John was not welcomed. And so the story we heard as his graduate students was that John had actually sent 1 or 2 graduate students in his place in order to access somewhat covertly those manuscripts that he needed for that project on same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe.
Shit, he's coming. Hide the gay marriages. Yeah, the friendship rituals, whatever the fuck. Hi, John. How are you? Yeah, you want to come in? Yeah, no, I can't. It's the boss, you know? Which boss? I mean, God. But the Pope, right? So that's... I know, you're a researcher. I know you know like 20 plus dead languages, don't you? You could really go to town on those manuscripts, but no, I can't let you in. Well, anyway, I will see you around. Have a good trip. Slay they, or whatever you all say. At the same time, queer theologians are participating in their own revisionism by emphasizing any instance of tolerance in Christianity's history and trying to explain away all of the intolerance throughout history. Like, queer theologians seem to disagree with the anti-homo consensus at the end of the Middle Ages, right? It's important that at the end of the Middle Ages, when Thomism, when we have this scholasticism, we're bringing it all together and making a very firm doctrine, it's important that it was anti-homosexual. You know, do they mean to imply that church authority is just wrong? Does that mean that we get to decide in today's day and age what's right and wrong? I don't know. In my opinion, a lot of queer theologians do their own interpreting instead of adhering to church authority and tradition. In the same way that they interpret a lot of things differently from traditionalists, and some of them think that the Christian sexual ethic is consent. Okay, I don't think that's right. I think that they sort of know, the way that a secular person would suggest, that much of this is really political and not divinely inspired. If the Catholic Church changed their policy on homosexuality tomorrow, right, wouldn't people just have to accept it? There was a time that the Catholic Church was in favor of slavery, when the church opposed democracy. But it changes based on the times. And nowadays, I mean, a lot of men and women are in committed same-sex marriages that St. Paul couldn't even dream of, right? Couldn't even conceptualize. And if those gay people today are happy, productive members of society, what exactly does the homosexual act do to defile them? Like, really? Certainly there was a time in history when procreation was pretty important as a species. In Paul's age, we probably really did need to populate the earth. Women needed to keep having kids because half the babies are like dead before they're 5 years old or whatever. But nowadays, with a record number of humans on this planet and medical advancements that allow many kids to reach adulthood, what is the moral necessity of procreation for each and every individual person? Aren't there other ways to give back to society besides having kids? I mean, fucking hell, Jesus was celibate. Jesus was celibate. God, I'm just like screaming in my apartment. So I do think that the Catholic Church could go back on Paul's word and make a determination. Since Paul didn't know about monogamous homosexuality, how can the church be so sure that he'd be against it? And I think that the church could reasonably take a stance in favor of monogamous homosexuality, arguing that such a concept never existed in ancient times and that such committed relationships can align with the church's emphasis on marital fidelity. I mean, if we're living in a totally different reality from what Paul or Aquinas knew, then isn't it really up for today's church to decide if monogamous homosexuality is consistent with the principles of the religion? Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Okay, I forgot about that. I didn't forget about that. Shit. No, I guess the Protestants can do whatever they want. So, although I have reservations about queer Christianity as a theology, from a secular humanist perspective, it's probably a good thing that queer theology exists. Because if queer Christians manage to make their religion more accepting of gay people than in the past, a secular person doesn't care if it's truly theologically consistent. They would just care that gay rights are gaining more traction in religious spaces. You know, it's the same with women pastors, like when they came into the mainstream. Here again, we have like St. Paul in the Bible saying women need to shut the fuck up, fucking incel behavior. But a lot of churches have gone on perfectly fine with women in leadership. And that helps women in society broadly. So even if queer theology isn't like capital T true, I can at least appreciate what it's doing to change societal attitudes as a queer person who does not identify as a Christian, just an anxious agnostic. I'm just anxious, okay? I'm just a little bit on edge all the time. We're all gonna die anyway, right? You might as well do some homosexual acts, cross your fingers and hope for the best.
Likewise, the characteristic attitude of the ancient world towards gay people was separate but equal. A poem that seems to me to embody this is a poem which goes, Zeus came as an eagle to godlike Ganymede, as a swan to the fair-haired mother of Helen. There is no comparison between the two things. One person likes one, another likes the other. That is, Ganymede is gay, Helen is straight. One person likes one, another person likes the other. Sometimes separate but equal went to the point of being even separate but superior. Some of you may know that in Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium, he says that gay people, in fact, make the best statesmen. Men who pursue the masculine and delight to lie with men and be embraced by men have the most manly nature. On reaching maturity, they alone prove in a public career to be men. I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it shows very clearly a separate but equal notion.